You are never supposed to hear this. Not like this. Not in a way that feels like someone reached past your thoughts and touched something deeper. Because what you carry was never meant to be explained in ordinary language. It was meant to be recognized. And yet here you are, which means something has already started. Before this moment, before this video, before you even knew what to look for, there was a pattern forming around your life. Subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, but persistent. People watched you, not always openly, not always obviously, but closely. They studied how you moved, how you spoke, how you handled pressure, how you created something out of nothing. And then they tried to do the same. At first it looked like they were succeeding. They copied your rhythm, your style, your decisions, even your silence. And for a moment, it seemed like they were becoming you. But then something happened. Every single time. Something they could never explain. Their progress stopped. Their results collapsed. Their confidence fractured. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but inevitably. As if they had reached an invisible boundary they couldn't cross. And no matter how much they adjusted, refined, or pushed harder, they couldn't get past it. That's when confusion turned into frustration. Because they had done everything right. Everything visible. Everything learnable. Everything repeatable. So why did it keep failing? Why did it work for you effortlessly, while they struggled to recreate even a fraction of it? The answer is the part no one wants to admit. Because it cannot be stolen. It cannot be taught, and it cannot be replicated. What they were trying to copy was never in what you were doing. It was in what you are. There is something about your presence that operates beyond logic. Before you say a word, before you take an action, before you prove anything, something in the atmosphere shifts. People feel it. Some are drawn to it instantly. Others feel uncomfortable without knowing why. But no one remains unaffected. Because your energy does something that most people's cannot. It reorganizes, not just emotions, not just attention, reality. And that's where the first sign reveals itself. You don't need to announce yourself. You don't need to demand attention. You don't need to prove your worth. Because something about you already speaks. Before you ever do. You've walked into rooms where nothing was said. Yet everything changed. Conversation shifted. Eyes turned. Silence carried weight. And even you couldn't fully explain why. You thought it was coincidence. You thought it was timing. But it wasn't. It was alignment. The kind that cannot be manufactured. The kind that cannot be learned. The kind that people sense, but cannot define. And the moment someone tries to imitate that without carrying it, they hit the wall. That invisible wall. The one that stops everything. The second sign is even more unsettling. Because it doesn't happen loudly. It happens quietly. The people who tried to become you disappear. Not in a dramatic way, not with failure on display, but slowly, silently. They fade out of the space they tried to dominate. Their energy weakens, their presence dissolves, and eventually they are gone. Not because they lacked talent, not because they didn't work hard, but because they encountered something they had no framework to understand. Your frequency. It doesn't compete. It doesn't argue. It doesn't even defend itself. It simply exists. And in its existence, it exposes everything that is not real. That's why imitation cannot survive near it. Because imitation requires surface, and you operate from depth. The third sign is the one you've probably questioned the most, because it doesn't make sense. The moments where you try the least, produce the most. You've had experiences where something came to you naturally, effortlessly, almost casually, and it created results that others couldn't achieve with maximum effort. You didn't overthink it. You didn't force it. You didn't calculate every move. You simply acted, and somehow, it worked. Not just worked, exceeded expectations. And that's when doubt tried to enter, because it felt too easy, too smooth, too aligned. You started wondering if it was luck, if it was temporary, if it would disappear the moment you relied on it. But it didn't, because it wasn't random, it was resonance. You were operating in a space where things respond to you differently, where effort is not the primary force. Alignment is, and that is something no one can copy, because alignment cannot be seen. It can only be felt. The fourth sign is the one that unsettles people the most. Because it defies everything they understand about opposition. Every attack against you reverses. Situations that were meant to break you, build you. Moments designed to end your progress, accelerate it. Energy directed to weaken you, returns with greater force, but not in the way anyone expects. You've been in situations where it looked like you were losing, where everything pointed to collapse, where the pressure was undeniable, and yet something shifted at the last moment, at the exact point where things should have ended. They turned, not slightly, completely, and what was meant to destroy you became the very thing that elevated you, not by chance, not by luck, but by design. A design you didn't create consciously, but one that operates through you, and people notice this. Even if they don't speak about it, they see the pattern. They feel the inconsistency between what should happen and what actually happens, and it unsettles them, because it means there is a force at play that they cannot predict and cannot control. The fifth sign is the one you rarely talk about, because it sounds impossible to explain. You just know. Not everything, not always, but enough to move without hesitation, enough to trust something beyond logic, enough to act even when there is no visible proof. You've made decisions that didn't make sense at the time. You've followed instincts that had no clear source. You've walked paths that others questioned, and yet they led exactly where they needed to. You can't trace it back to information. You can't attribute it to experience alone. It's something else, something internal, something constant, a knowing that exists independently of circumstantially. And that is what makes your presence unsettling to those who rely only on what they can see. Because you are not operating from the same level. You are not responding to the same signals. You are not limited by the same boundaries. And that's why copying you fails every time. Because what you carry is not external. It is not a method. It is not a system. It is not a formula. It is a frequency. And frequency cannot be imitated. It can only be received. But here's the part no one tells you. Not everyone is meant to receive it. Not everyone is capable of holding it. And not everyone can survive being exposed to it for too long. Because it reveals things. Not just about the world, but about themselves. It exposes gaps. It highlights inconsistencies. It brings forward truths people spend their entire lives avoiding. And that's why some people distance themselves from you without explanation. That's why some connections add without conflict. That's why some environments feel like they reject you, even when you have done nothing wrong. It's not rejection, it's misalignment. And once you understand that, everything changes. You stop trying to be understood by those who cannot perceive you. You stop shrinking yourself to fit spaces that cannot hold you. You stop explaining what was never meant to be explained. And you start moving differently, not louder, not harder, but clearer, more precise, more intentional. Because you realize something most people never do. You were never here to be replicated. You were never here to blend in. You were never here to follow patterns. You were here to disrupt them. And disruption does not ask for permission. It does not wait for approval. It does not adjust to comfort. It moves. And when it moves, everything around it has to respond, whether it's ready or not. So the next time you notice someone trying to mirror you, watch closely. Not what they do, but what happens after. Because the pattern will repeat. It always does. They will reach that point. That invisible boundary, that silent wall, and they will stop. Not because they chose to, but because they have to. Because what lies beyond that point was never theirs to access. It was yours, and it always will be. Not because you earned it, not because you built it, but because it was placed within you, long before you understood what it meant. And now you're starting to see it, not fully, not completely, but enough to recognize that something about your existence was never ordinary, and never will be. Which brings you to the question most people never ask. If this is true, if this frequency is real, if this pattern has been present your entire life, then what happens when you stop ignoring it? Because up until now, you've only been operati. NG at a fraction of it, a controlled version, a limited expression, a version that still tries to make sense of everything. But what if that changes? What if you stop filtering it? What if you stop doubting it? What if you stop holding it back? Because the moment that happens, the pattern doesn't just continue, it evolves. And when it evolves, it doesn't just affect you, it affects everything connected to you. Seen and unseen, known and unknown, expected and unexpected. And that is the moment everything shifts. Not gradually, not slowly, but all at once. And when it does, there will be no going back, because you will finally understand why it was never meant to be copied, and why it could only ever be you. At the end of everything you thought you understood, it begins. Not at the start, not in the obvious moments, but right there, where things stopped making sense, where the patterns broke, where the outcomes didn't match the effort, where people you expected to stay, left, and people you never noticed started watching. That's where the story actually starts. Because what you've been experiencing was never random. It only looked that way because you were seeing it from the middle, not the design. There has always been a sequence to your life, a structure beneath the surface, a rhythm that doesn't follow normal timing. You've noticed it, haven't you? Moments where everything feels delayed, like nothing is happening, like you've been forgotten. And then suddenly everything moves at once. Doors open. Opportunities appear. Situations shift. People reach out. And it happens so fast, you barely have time to process it. As if something invisible was holding everything back until the exact moment it was meant to release. That's not coincidence. That's calibration. 'Cause what operates through you doesn't move on steam. It moves on alignment. And alignment doesn't follow urgency. It follows precision. Which is why there were times you felt stuck. Times you questioned everything. Times you wondered if you were falling behind. But what you didn't realize was that you were never behind. You were being positioned. Placed exactly where you needed to be so that when things did move, they wouldn't just work, they would lock into place. That's why when your moments come, they don't feel chaotic. They feel inevitable. Like something that was always going to happen, finally did. And the people around you feel it too. Even if they don't understand it, they sense the shift. They notice the difference. Because something about your presence changes when you're in alignment. It sharpens. It intensifies. It becomes undeniable. And that's when the attention comes. Not always supportive, not always positive, but unavoidable. Because you start operating at a level that cannot be ignored. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. They think it's about visibility. They think it's about success. They think it's about recognition. But it's not. It's about impact. The kind that doesn't ask for attention, but commands it anyway. And that's where the tension begins. Because not everyone responds well to something they cannot control. Not everyone is comfortable being around something they cannot predict. Not everyone can accept something they cannot become. So they try. They observe. They analyze. They break you down into pieces they think they can understand. They study your patterns, your tone, your choices, your silence, and then they attempt to reconstruct it, to replicate it, to become it. And for a moment, it looks convincing, close enough to create confusion, close enough to blur the difference, close enough to make you question yourself. But then it happens, that same point, that same limit, that same invisible boundary. They reach it, and everything stops, because what they copied was never the source. It was the surface. And surface doesn't survive pressure, only structure does. That's why when resistance appears, you don't collapse. You transform. Pressure doesn't expose weakness in you, it activates something deeper, something that only reveals itself when it's needed. And that's what people cannot replicate, because it doesn't exist until the moment calls for it. It's not stored in memory, it's not built to repetition. It emerges exactly when it's required, which is why you've survived things that should have broken you. Not easily, not without impact, but completely. You didn't just endure, you adapted. You evolved. You came out different. Stronger in ways you can't fully explain. Clearer in ways that don't come from thinking. And that's when you started noticing something else. A separation. Not physical, but energetic. Certain people couldn't connect with you the same way anymore. Certain conversations felt empty. Certain environments felt off. Not wrong, just incompatible. And at first you tried to fix it, to adjust, to reconnect, to bring things back to how they were. But it never worked. Because it wasn't meant to. You weren't losing connection. You were outgrowing alignment. And growth doesn't maintain what it surpasses. It replaces it with something that matches the new level you've stepped into. Even if that level feels unfamiliar. Even if it feels isolating at times. Even if it makes you question what's happening. Because here's the truth most people avoid. Elevation is not comfortable. It separates before it connects. It clears before it builds. It removes before it replaces. And if you don't understand that, you'll mistake transformation for loss. But once you see it clearly, everything changes. You stop holding on to what's leaving. You stop chasing what's not aligned. You stop questioning what feels natural to release. And you start trusting something deeper, something that has been guiding you all along. That same knowing, that same quiet certainty, that doesn't need proof because it was never meant to be proven. It was meant to be followed. And the more you follow it, the clearer everything becomes. Not easier, not simpler, but more precise, more intentional, more real. You start to see patterns before they form. You start to feel shifts before they happened. You start to recognize what belongs and what doesn't instantly. And that's when control leaves the equation. Because you're no longer reacting. You're moving in sync with something ahead of you. Something that sees further than you do. Something that positions you before situations even arrive. And that's when the real shift happens. Not outside, inside, because you stop doubting. Not completely, but enough to move without hesitation. Enough to trust without needing confirmation. Enough to act without waiting for permission. And once that happens, everything accelerates. Not gradually, but in waves. Moments where everything aligns so perfectly, it feels unreal. Like you've stepped into something that was already prepared, waiting for you to arrive. And in a way, you have. Because none of this started now. None of this was triggered by a single moment. This has been unfolding your entire life, piece by piece, step by step, layer by layer. You just couldn't see it before, but now you can. At least enough to understand that what you carry was never accidental and never ordinary. Which brings you back to, where this all truly began. Not at the beginning, but at the end. At the point where confusion turned into awareness, where patterns turned into understanding, where questions turned into clarity. Because the end was never the conclusion, it was the activation point. The moment everything you've been through, everything you've experienced, everything you felt but couldn't explain, finally connects. And when it connects, it doesn't just make sense, it changes you. Completely. And once that change happens, there is no returning to who you were before. Because now you see it. Now you feel it. Now you recognize it. That invisible force, that internal alignment, that unexplainable knowing. It was never outside of you. It was always within you. Waiting, not to be discovered, but to be accepted. And now that you've reached this point, now that you've seen what most people never do, now that you understand what cannot be copied, there is only one thing left to ask yourself. What happens next? When you stop treating it like something rare and start living like it's who you are.